Somewhere deep inside Death Valley, there's a desert so flawlessly flat, so incredibly empty, that absolute stillness just feels like the only rule. I mean, nothing should ever move out here. And yet, it does. Just imagine standing out there on a completely cracked, dry lake bed. Right in front of you is this massive rock, and behind it, carved deep into the dirt, is a long, winding trail. But when you look around, nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, no animals. Just the rock, its path, and this eerie, total silence. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're totally decoding the century-old mystery of Racetrack Playa. Okay, let's dive into this, because this question has literally driven researchers crazy for decades. How exactly do rocks just move on their own across a perfectly flat desert? Now, we aren't talking about tiny pebbles tumbling down a hill. We're talking about a completely level, totally flat, dry lake bed inside Death Valley National Park. There's no heavy machinery operating out here, no pranksters pulling strings in the dead of night, and definitely no animals large enough to shove a boulder. Yet hundreds of rocks are just scattered across the playa, and every single one is dragging a deliberate, winding trail right behind it. What makes this whole thing so utterly fascinating is this one specific number, 100. For over 100 years, this mystery completely baffled the scientific community. And you know why? Because in all that time, through all those decades of mapping and obsessing over these trails, no human being had ever actually seen a single rock move. Not once. It was honestly like this giant magic trick happening in slow motion, but somehow only when everyone had their backs turned.
And we really need to grasp the sheer impossible physical scale of what we're looking at here. These aren't just little stones you'd skip across a pond. The rocks on Racetrack Playa can weigh up to 700 pounds. Think about that for a second. That is literally heavier than a full-sized grand piano. Imagine trying to drag a grand piano across a dry dirt field all by yourself. Now imagine doing it without leaving a single footprint. That's the sheer physical weight we're dealing with out here.
And the trails they leave behind? They aren't just short little scuffs in the dirt. Some of these tracks stretch for an astonishing 1,500 feet. To put that into perspective, that's nearly 5 football fields of continuous dragging. And if you notice, they don't just go in a straight line either. The trails curve, they zigzag, and sometimes they suddenly change direction entirely at these sharp, almost perfect angles. It's almost as if a 700-pound rock simply decided to take a left turn.
Moving right along to Section 1, the theories that failed.
Naturally, when you've got heavy boulders moving all on their own, human imagination tends to run pretty wild. Starting back in the 1940s, researchers descended on the playa and just started throwing everything at the wall. Theory 1. The Earth's own magnetic field was somehow pulling them. Yeah, nope. Theory 2. Hurricane-force winds. But think about the absurdity of that for a second. You'd need winds so apocalyptic they could physically shove a grand piano across open ground. Obviously not happening. Theory 3 proposed this coating of incredibly slippery algae on the playa. And then Theory 4 suggested these thick sheets of ice were lifting the rocks and carrying them along kind of like river rafts. Every single one of these sounded completely plausible on paper, but every single one eventually fell apart under actual scientific scrutiny.
So the crucial point is, when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains has to be the truth, right? But in this case, the truth turned out to be far stranger, and honestly far more delicate than anyone ever expected. It wasn't about raw, chaotic power or weird magnetic anomalies. It was actually about absolute, unbelievable precision. Which brings us to Section 2, Caught in the Act.
And this brings us right to the massive breakthrough. In 2011, a brilliant paleobiologist named Richard Norris and his team from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography decided they were going to solve this mystery once and for all. To pull it off, they essentially set up this incredibly high-tech scientific sting operation right in the middle of Death Valley. Just think about this setup. They fitted the actual rocks with custom-built GPS trackers to monitor any exact minute movements. On top of that, they installed a high-precision weather station right there on the playa, capable of measuring wind gusts, temperature, and moisture down to the absolute second. They literally rigged the desert to watch for them.
And then, well, they waited. And they waited some more. Actually, one of the researchers later jokingly called it the most boring experiment ever. And, you really can't blame them. I mean, these massive rocks can sit completely, totally motionless for a decade or more without budging a single inch. Imagine just staring at a boulder for years, waiting for it to do something. Talk about the ultimate test of patience. But hey,
Their patience finally paid off. 2 long years into the project, on December 21, 2013, the desert gave them an incredible gift. A completely rare winter rain swept through Death Valley. Now, because the Racetrack Playa is basically a giant basin, that rain pulled up and formed a very shallow pond stretching all the way across the previously completely dry dirt.
So overnight, temperatures completely plummeted and that shallow water froze solid. The next day, right around midday, the desert sun started to really beat down. The researchers were just standing there when they suddenly heard something completely unexpected. Popping, cracking. It was the distinct sound of fracturing ice just echoing across the desert. One of them literally said, "This is it." And right there, for the very first time in recorded human history, they actually watched the sailing stones move.
Let's look at Section 3, the Goldilocks phenomenon.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what was happening all along. What they witnessed wasn't some magic miracle. It was a perfectly timed symphony of physics. It happens in exactly 4 razor-thin steps. Step 1, that super rare winter rain forms a shallow pond, deep enough to freeze but shallow enough that the rocks still remain partly exposed. Step 2, overnight temperatures drop, freezing the water into this window pane ice sheet, which is literally just a few millimeters thick. Step 3, the midday sun warms the surface, and that fragile ice cracks apart into these massive floating panels. And finally, Step 4, driven by nothing more than a gentle, light breeze. We're not talking hurricane winds here, just a simple breeze. These floating ice panels act exactly like sails. They push against the exposed rocks, slowly shoving them forward. And because the mud underneath is now wet and perfectly slippery, the rocks just glide, effortlessly carving those long silent trails as they go.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that this completely debunks every single wild theory that came before it, right? There was no weird magnetic field, there was no hidden supernatural force at play. It is quite simply a Goldilocks phenomenon. This perfectly timed, deeply delicate balance of rain, freezing temperatures, sun, and wind is so incredibly rare, the conditions might only align exactly like this maybe once every 10 years. The ice has to be just thick enough to push the rock, but thin enough to move with a super light breeze. Honestly, it's just breathtaking, natural precision.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 4, Planetary Science and Beyond.
Because discovering how a bunch of rocks move in California isn't just about satisfying some curious desert trivia question. The implications here actually reach way out into the cosmos. You might be wondering, well, why does this dry desert lakebed matter to places like Mars? Well, planetary scientists study things like dust devils and unusual surface movements on other planets all the time. And they look at Racetrack Playa as a massive, natural, earthbound laboratory. It's one of the very few places where extremely delicate, rarely seen physical processes can actually be observed, measured, and tracked in a completely controlled way. The takeaway here is really profound. By finally understanding a 100-year-old mystery right here on our own planet, we are literally teaching ourselves how to read the landscapes of worlds we haven't even reached yet. Today, the massive rocks of Racetrack Playa might sit entirely motionless for another decade, just silently waiting for that exact, fragile combination of rain, ice, and wind to return. But the beautiful difference is, now, for the first time in over a century, we finally know their secret.
And I think this leaves us with an absolutely incredible realization about our own world. If a flat, totally dry lakebed can secretly host floating ice panels that push 700-pound boulders hundreds of feet without anyone noticing, what other impossible places on Earth shouldn't exist but somehow do? What other incredibly delicate, invisible phenomena are happening right under our noses, just waiting for someone to finally look at exactly the right time? Keep questioning the world around you, and I'll see you in the next explainer.